So how does my rendering system works? Well, first you need to understand how it even knows what to render, and then you can know how. So if you have seen my last video, which if you haven't, you should watch it right now. But if you have seen it, then you know I implemented ECS to my engine, and the component that says that something should render is called renderable, which is creative exactly as my drawings when I was a kid, but whatever. Now, what my renderable component has as its data? Well, it only has shared pointer to my model object. So when I type something like this, then my engine stores that component and its entity ID. But having model isn't enough. To render something, we also need its transformation, so you also need to add transform component, otherwise engine will warn you that you don't have transform component for that renderable entity. And same goes for light entities. They also need transform component, and after these checks, only the renderables and lights with transforms are sent to renderer, plus also the entity from which our world is rendered, and its camera component. But if our entity misses camera component or transform, we logically can't render anything, so this launches my engine assert, and the program crashes and tells you what is missing, but I can tell that you definitely miss some bitches, little bro. Okay, but now when we finally know what to render, now comes the question how to render it. So firstly, we set our active camera to camera we pass to our renderer. So we know which camera to use, and then we use openGL function that clears our color and the buffers. So previous frame data don't corrupt our current frame. And then we just use for each loop for every renderable where we get our model pointer. With that we get vector of our meshes, and so for every mesh we use another for each loop where we set the right shader for that mesh. Currently now I only have default shader for all meshes, and then we bind our vertex array object that basically tells openGL to load our mesh vertices, indices that tells how to connect these vertices with each other, and finally it sets our vertex attribute pointers, which tells openGL how our data is formed so it can read it properly. And now we have three functions: set MVP, set lights, and set materials. So we will start with the first one obviously, and that's set MVP. And if you are asking what MVP means, well, it means most valuable programmer, which is of course me. Nah, just joking, and I'm kind of far from it, I guess, but what it really means now, well, it means model, view, projection. These are three matrices we have to send to our shader for our models to be rendered correctly on our screen. Model is basically a matrix that says what's position of our object in our world. Then view matrix is basically position of that object relative to our POI position. And projection is matrix that says how to render it so it looks same as in real world, where something that's far seems smaller and vice versa. So in our set MVP we just calculate these things and set them to our shader, with also our viewer position and our front vector for light computations in our shader. Then we have set lights function, which basically takes all lights and by their type, like direction, point, or spotlight, we assign them to each of these lights arrays in our shader and send its light data there. And then our last function before rendering is set materials, which is kinda same as set lights, except of deciding which light type it is. It decides which type of textures our mesh has, diffuse or specular, and then based on that it again assigns these textures to each of these arrays. And if you are asking what if our model doesn't have any texture, well, first of all, thanks for that annoying question, because now I have to answer it. And secondly, what it actually does in such a case is that when we initialize our engine, it makes two default textures, entirely black and entirely white texture. So for diffuse texture, which is basically color of our object, we set it to default white so we can see it, and for specular we set it to default black because it logically doesn't need specular light when there is no such a texture. And finally, after all these things, we can render our mesh. Not model, but mesh. If you don't know what's the difference, it's easy. Model is model, and meshes are basically just the parts which the artists use to make that model. For example, when we have car, it is model, but it's made of meshes like wheels, lights, steering wheel, etc. So we make this process for every mesh, as you could tell from that for each loop for meshes, and then we swap our frame buffers, because everything we rendered was in the second frame buffer that we couldn't see on our screen, because if it wouldn't, we would see everything being rendered mesh by mesh and not by whole frame on our screen. So that's the reason for 2 buffers. So we swap it for our current buffer, and now we have everything rendered on screen. And as last thing, we poll events because we are at the end of frame, just as at the end of this video. So thanks for watching, and if you would give this video a like and also subscribe my channel, I would suck your day, and that's worth it.